My name is Evelyn Harper, and I was born in Springfield, Illinois, in a house with a white porch and a neat lawn that the neighbors mowed more often than they cared about other people's lives. It seemed like a typical American family. My father an engineer, my mother a homemaker, neat family photos in frames, a flag by the entrance on holidays. But I wasn't in those frames for a long time. I was born with cerebral palsy. My brain worked perfectly. The doctors said so immediately and confidently, but my body decided to play by its own rules. My right leg trailed behind my left, my back had a life of its own, and my left arm seemed constantly unsure whether it was worth participating in anything at all. I didn't look like everyone else, and that was enough to become a problem from the very beginning. My mother didn't hold me for the first few weeks. Someone told me about it later. Not her, of course. She generally tried never to talk about my childhood, as if ignoring the past would make it cease to exist. My primary caregiver was a nanny named Linda, whom my grandmother insisted on hiring. Linda was patient, gentle, and meticulous, but she was a stranger. And a child always senses when they're held because they have to, not because they want to. My grandmother's name was Margaret Harper, and frankly, she was the first person who saw me as a person, not a diagnosis. She lived in Chicago and didn't visit as often as I'd have liked, but each visit was like a breath of fresh air. She didn't wince when I awkwardly reached for her, nor did she look away when I fell. She simply picked me up, dusted off my knees, and said, "Well, Evie, the ground was especially inviting to you today." When I started trying to walk, the house turned into an obstacle course. I'd take a few steps and fall. My knees were constantly bruised. Mom stood next to me, her arms folded. "You have to learn to stand up on your own," she said dryly. There was no concern in her voice, only irritation. I realized early on, it wasn't my upbringing that was the problem. She simply didn't want to touch me. When I was 5, Mom got pregnant again. The house suddenly became lively, full of laughter and discussions about the future. 9 months later, Lily was born, rosy-cheeked, healthy, perfect. Mom blossomed. She carried Lily in her arms, took endless photos, and posted them on social media with captions like, "My happiness." I watched from the outside, trying to understand where my right to be happiness, too, had gone. After Lily was born, I became almost invisible. Not out of anger, but out of convenience. It's easier to ignore what causes discomfort. My childhood shrank to a few rooms. "It's inconvenient to go to the mall," my mother said. "My friends have stairs at home. It's unsafe," my father added, avoiding my gaze. I understood. It wasn't the stairs. They were ashamed. By the age of 6, I had crutches. On bad days, a wheelchair. I didn't complain. I learned early on not to complain. Complaining didn't change anything. Only my grandmother's attitude changed. She paid for massages, therapy, and doctors my parents didn't even want to hear about. "She has potential," she told the doctors. "She has a future," she told me. They sent me to a specialized school, not a regular one, at my grandmother's expense, of course. "It will be easier for you there," my father said. I heard something else. "We don't want you around normal kids." Every morning, a chauffeured car picked me up. No good luck. No goodbye hugs. Just a closing door. At school, I was among the same inconvenient kids, and for the first time in my life, it didn't feel humiliating. We were different but equal. And yet, when I saw other kids being dropped off by their parents, something inside me clenched. The most vivid moments of my childhood were spent with my grandmother. She took me to Chicago museums, drove me along the waterfront, took me on little trips to Milwaukee, Madison, sometimes just out of town. "The world is bigger than your bedroom, Evie," she'd say. "And you have every right to it." One day, after a tough therapy session, I burst into tears. "Why all this?" I asked. "I'll never be normal anyway." My grandmother took my chin and forced me to look her in the eyes. "Normality is the most overrated thing in the world," she said. "You're not broken. You're just different. And that's no reason to hide." At that moment, I didn't yet know how much those words would change my life. I was just a girl they didn't want to see. But that same strength was already beginning to grow within me, quiet, stubborn, refusing to disappear completely. The house in Springfield was always neat, almost sterile. Light walls, furniture without sharp corners, carpets that were comfortable for pushing a stroller. Everything was arranged as if I lived there, and yet as if I shouldn't be there. It's a strange feeling. You're physically present, but emotionally absent, like a piece of furniture they try to ignore. When guests came to the house, this feeling became almost tangible. Mom prepared in advance. She set the table, got out the good china, dressed Lily in lace dresses. And then she'd come up to me. "Evie, darling," she'd say in that same voice that made my insides go cold. "Why don't you stay in your room? We'll sit for a while and talk." At first, I tried to object. "I want to sit too." "You'll be tired," she'd reply instantly. "And people will be awkward." Awkward. The word that explained everything. I'd turn the stroller around and go to my room, close the door, and sit there, listening to the adults laughing in the living room, the clinking of glasses, the way a normal family lived without me. Over time, the pain dulled, but it didn't disappear. It simply became background noise. I learned to fill the silence. At first, with food. I started helping Linda in the kitchen. Chopping vegetables was difficult. My left hand was wobbly. The knife dropped a couple of times. I cut myself and broke a plate. Mom sighed as if I was doing it out of spite. But Linda smiled. "It's okay, Evie. Everyone learns." Then there was drawing. Grandma brought me a sketchbook and a set of pencils. I drew crooked lines, the wrong color of the sky, people with disproportionate bodies. But these drawings had something I didn't have in my real life: freedom. There, no one looked with disgust if a line went the wrong way. I started writing by accident. I found an old notebook and began writing down everything I couldn't say out loud. Short phrases, sometimes rhymes, sometimes just words. They weren't poetry, it was a way to keep from exploding inside. At first, I thought I had an ally, Lily. When she was little, she loved me sincerely, without reservation. She would come into my room, climb onto my bed, and look at my drawings. "Evie, draw me," she asked one day, getting my name wrong. I drew it, crookedly, but from the heart. She pressed the sheet to her chest and laughed. Mom came in without knocking. She saw Lily next to me, and her face changed. "Lily, come here," she said sharply. "But, Evie, right now." She took the drawing and placed it on the nightstand, as if it were infected. "Let's go play in your room." From that moment on, everything changed. Every time Lily reached out to me, Mom intervened. Gradually, my sister stopped coming. She was learning what teaches better than any words: shame. By her teens, Lily had become a carbon copy of Mom. Confident, beautiful, popular. She always had friends, laughter, plans. I had a room. One day, I went to the kitchen to get water, not knowing Lily had company. When she saw me, her face twisted. "Evie, what are you doing?" she hissed. "I have friends. Go back." I turned around without saying a word. It hurt, but not surprising. Pain is more familiar when you expect it. School remained the only place where I didn't feel like a mistake. But even there, I knew. My world was limited. My parents were almost never involved in my life. They didn't come to events, didn't ask about my friends, didn't care about my life. The only person who saw me fully was my grandmother. The highlight was her 70th birthday. She decided to celebrate it at a restaurant in downtown Chicago. Good, she emphasized over the phone. Mom came to me right away. Evie, you're not feeling well, are you?
No, irraplia.
I'm feeling fine.
I'll go.
When Grandma came to pick me up and saw that I was ready, she just smiled. The restaurant was noisy, bright, and normal. Relatives were talking to me. They were asking how I was doing. It was almost surreal. Mom kept her distance. When I dropped my fork, she grimaced. Grandma calmly picked it up and continued the conversation as if nothing had happened. When Dad suggested going home, Grandma looked at him in a way that made him shut up. On the way back, I realized for the first time, the problem wasn't me. The problem is those who are incapable of seeing beyond their own comfort. And this understanding began to change me from the inside. Adolescence arrived quietly, without slamming doors or loud scandals.
I simply had more time to think.
Thinking is a dangerous thing when your life consists of observing how others live. I watched Lily, her ease, the way the world seemed to open up to her. I watched my parents, who became softer, more alive, more humane around her. With me, they were just a function, to feed, to heal, to support. Loving wasn't part of the curriculum. I graduated from high school with good grades at a specialized school. The teachers praised my essays, saying I had a sense of words. I nodded and smiled, but inside I didn't believe it. In our house, believing in me wasn't customary. My grandmother's faith seemed almost mythical, too good to be true. I prepared for graduation seriously. I bought a simple dress and chose shoes that could be worn over my orthotics. I was nervous, as if it wasn't a school event that lay ahead, but an exam to prove my right to exist. On graduation day, I looked out into the crowded hall and knew my parents wouldn't come. And so it turned out. They were busy. But my grandmother sat in the front row and applauded, as if I were winning an Oscar. After graduation, the familiar emptiness reigned in the house again. And then suddenly everything changed. My parents began preparing for their 20th wedding anniversary. It became the event of the year. They decided to make a movie, a real one, with a director, cameraman, and editor. About our love story, my mother said with a smile that lacked warmth. For 2 weeks, the house acted like a film set. We were taken to various places, a park, a country club, a yacht. How they even got a yacht, I still don't understand. We changed clothes, smiled, sang some silly songs. And for the first time in a long time, I was part of the process. It might be strained and awkward, but it was part nonetheless. I decided to give them a gift. I wrote a poem, a real one, about love, time, family. I rehearsed it night after night, afraid to slip up. When it was time to record, I read it out loud. My heart was pounding. Very sweet, Mom said without looking. Lily, get ready for the piano. I still held out hope.
Silly yes.
Hope is the most resilient thing. The film premiered at Grandma's. Big screen, guests, champagne. I sat next to her, clutching the armrest of the stroller. The film began beautifully, a wedding, youth, laughter. I waited for myself, but the minutes passed and I wasn't there. Not in the past, not in the present, not even in the shots of us all together. I was edited out. Completely. When the lights went out, Grandma stood up and turned off the projector. Where's Evelyn? She asked calmly. Mom started making excuses. Photogenicity, format, concept. Then Lily screamed. She's a disgrace. I didn't want her in the film. These words struck me like a blow to my spine. Grandma kicked them all out and announced that I was her heir, that everything would go to me. That evening, my old life ended. I left with my grandmother. In her house, I felt like I could breathe for the first time, and ahead lay the unknown. But it no longer frightened me, because nothing could be worse than being erased. Moving to my grandmother's place didn't feel like an escape or a dramatic break with the past. It was like stepping out of a windowless room into the street after a long winter. Everything seemed the same. I was still me, my body still resisted every sudden movement, but the air felt different. Freer. More real. My grandmother's house in Chicago was large, old, and vibrant. It didn't feel sterile like my parents' house. The floorboards creaked, paintings hung on the walls, and the kitchen always smelled of coffee and cinnamon. Most importantly, no one tried to hide me here. I was part of the space, not an intrusion. For the first few days, we hardly talked about what had happened. My grandmother gave me time. She generally knew how to give time, a rare talent. But one morning, she placed a cup of coffee in front of me, sat down across from me, and said, "Well, Evie, now let's think about how you want to live your life." I was confused. This question was new, unfamiliar. In my world, decisions were always made for me. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Great," Grandma nodded. "Then let's start with the search." She didn't press. She didn't demand 10-year plans. We started small, with my day. I chose when to get up, what to wear, what to do. These little things suddenly seemed incredibly important. They restored a sense of control that had been taken from me long before I learned to recognize it. A couple of weeks later, Grandma brought up the subject again. "You were always writing," she said, "and drawing. Do you like that?" "Yes," I answered without hesitation. "Then we'll do that." She spoke as if the decision had already been made, and the world had to adapt. And the world began to adapt. We went to look at colleges. Not just any colleges, with ramps, elevators, adapted classrooms. For the first time, I didn't feel like a burden. I was an applicant, a future student, a person with a choice. I enrolled in the literature and visual arts department at a small college on the north side of Chicago. My grandmother insisted that I have an assistant, not as a symbol of weakness, but as a tool for independence. "Freedom isn't doing everything yourself," she said. "It's being able to do what you want." The first day of school was terrifying. I expected stares, whispers, awkwardness. But there were none. People asked questions, normal human ones. Someone helped me open the door without making a heroic gesture out of it. The professors spoke to me, not over me. I immersed myself in my studies. Literature became both my refuge and my weapon. I learned to call things by their proper names, to distill pain into words, to transform chaos into structure. My teachers noted my honesty. "You're not afraid to be uncomfortable," Professor Miller once said. That's rare. My drawing changed, too. My lines became more confident. I stopped trying to make things beautiful and began making things truthful. My work was strange, sometimes harsh, but there was life in it, and it was noticed. I received my first congratulatory letter. My poem had won a student competition. I reread it 10 times, disbelieving. My grandmother hung the printout on the refrigerator. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. Sometimes the pain returned. I thought about my parents, about Lily, about how perhaps they were living peacefully, as if I'd never existed. But now the thought didn't destroy me. It simply was. I no longer lived in silence. I filled the world with my voice. And, to my surprise, it began to respond. By the middle of my second year, I suddenly found myself no longer counting down the days until the weekend and no longer dreading Mondays. The campus ceased to be a labyrinth of ramps, doors, and glances. It became the territory of my life. Not ideal, not easy, but real. People began to recognize me. Sometimes by name, sometimes by my lyrics. "You're that Evelyn, right? The one who read about the house with no windows." I nodded, and each time I felt a strange warmth. Not even pride, a confirmation that I existed beyond my own head. I began performing more often. Poetry evenings, open mics, small festivals. I'd will myself onto the stage in a wheelchair, lay out the sheets of paper, take a breath, and speak.
No justifications. No explanations.
Just speaking. About a body that doesn't obey. About a family that loves selectively. About the silence in which one can either disappear or cultivate a voice. After one performance, a girl approached me and said, "I never thought it was possible to speak about pain like that, without asking for pity. Thank you." I kept those words in my head for a long time, like a treasure. My grandmother rejoiced at every success I had, as if it were her own. She went with me to some performances, sitting in the front row, her bag on her lap, her back straight, as if she were the one stepping up to the microphone. But I could see she was struggling. She began to tire more easily, sometimes losing the thread of the conversation. "Don't you dare slow down because of me," she said once when I suggested skipping the reading. "If you stop, I'll never forgive you." She was the first to talk about the book. "You already have the material," she said, leafing through my notebooks. "It's not just poetry. It's history." I was afraid. The book seemed too big, too serious. But Grandma sent me a selection herself, without asking permission. The reply came a month later. A small independent publisher. Limited edition.
But yes.
I reread the letter over and over, disbelieving. "See," Grandma said, "the world didn't end." It was at this point that the past decided to make itself felt. My father wrote to me for the first time in many years. Briefly,
Cautiously.
almost formally. They had heard about my publications. They wanted to meet. I didn't reply for a long time. Not out of fear, but out of indifference, which turned out to be unexpectedly difficult. Finally, I agreed. We met at a cafe near campus. My mother looked older than I remembered. Lily, confident, beautiful, alien.
They talked about themselves.
About how hard it had been for them. How they didn't know what was right. I listened and suddenly realized they were waiting for forgiveness. But I didn't have it. Not out of anger. Simply because some things can't be cured with words. "I'm glad you're okay." I said goodbye. "Me too." And then I left. A few weeks later, Grandma was gone. She died quietly at night, in her sleep. I held her hand until the very end and thought about how much strength she had held. How much love. How much faith. When I was alone in her house, the silence didn't frighten me. It was full. I knew. My voice would never be hidden again. After Grandma died, the world didn't collapse, it changed. It was strange and even a little shameful to realize. I always thought that if she left, I would fall apart along with her, because she was my foundation. But it turned out she'd carefully built this foundation inside me long ago. And now, standing alone in her house, I didn't feel empty. I felt responsible for myself, for my life, for everything she believed in. The first weeks were hard. The house was too big, too quiet. I caught myself waiting for her footsteps, her voice from the kitchen, her usual, "Evie, have you had breakfast yet?" Sometimes I'd answer out loud, and then laugh through my tears. The grief wasn't sharp, it was deep, like water in which you learn to breathe again. I returned to school almost immediately. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. College became my anchor, my rhythm, my proof that life goes on not in spite of, but alongside loss. I worked on a book, editing texts, choosing illustrations, arguing with the editor over every comma. This was my first real responsibility to the world. The book came out in the spring. A small print run, a simple cover, my real name, not abbreviated. When I held it in my hands, they trembled. Not from spasticity, but from awareness. This was me.
Whole.
Uncut.
No cuts.
At the first presentation in a small bookstore, it was crowded. People sat right on the floor, some stood against the walls. I read the poems out loud, and suddenly caught myself no longer thinking about how I looked. I thought about the words, about getting them across. And they did. After the reading, all sorts of people approached me. Young, old, parents of children with disabilities, people without visible injuries but with the same look, the look of someone who had been overlooked for a long time.
Thank you, they said.
I felt the same way. And each time I realized my story was no longer just mine. I no longer spoke with my parents, not out of revenge, but out of clarity. Sometimes the messages came cautious, awkward. I didn't answer. It wasn't an escape, but a choice. I no longer wanted to prove my right to exist to those who denied it. I bumped into Lily one day by chance, on the street, downtown. She stopped, confused. I read your book, she said. I nodded. I was ashamed, she added. I looked at her carefully. This is your path, I replied. Not mine. And I moved on. I started teaching, leading poetry and visual expression workshops for teenagers with disabilities. Not as a motivational role model, but as someone who knew what it was like to be invisible. I didn't teach being strong. I taught being honest, with yourself, with the world. Sometimes the pain returned. Sometimes my body failed me more than usual. Sometimes I felt angry, at randomness, at injustice, at the fact that some people have it easier. But now that anger had an outlet.
Paper. Words. People.
On the anniversary of my grandmother's death, I went to Lake Michigan. I sat by the water, holding a book in my lap, and spoke to it in my mind. I thanked her. I promised. I laughed. I cried. All at once. I was no longer a girl hidden in a room. I was a woman who had taken my place. Being visible doesn't mean being comfortable. Being visible means being alive. And I was.